Hello, everyone. Nope. Thank you so much for joining us today on this cold, snowy winter day at Dia Beacon. My name is Jordan Carter, curator and co-department head here at Dia. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you all here for a lecture and a conversation today on the occasion of the exhibition Maren Hassinger. So after I do some brief introductions, we'll be joined by Allie Tepper here, who's going to give a short lecture sort of focusing on Maren's piece Field, which is on display right here with us. And then Maren and I will actually join Allie in conversation, and then hopefully we'll have some time to open it up for audience questions as well. And now to sort of briefly introduce our speakers. Maren Hassinger was born in Los Angeles in 1947. She received a BA in sculpture from Bennington College in Vermont in 1969 and an MFA in fiber structure from the University of California, Los Angeles in 1973. Often making use of both organic and mass-produced materials, including branches, plastic bags, newspapers, and wire rope, her signature material we can see on view here. Hassinger's work engages with the natural environment and its intersections with issues related to humanity. In the 1970s, Hassinger was involved with Studio Z, a loose collective of artists that included Houston Conwill, David Hammons, and Senga Nengudi, among others. She has also had solo exhibitions and projects at numerous institutions, including the Art Institute of Chicago, where her work is also currently on view, Aspen Art Museum in Colorado, the Baltimore Museum of Art, Boca Raton Museum of Art, Florida, Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens, and Spelman College Museum of Art in Atlanta. In 2021, the artist presented Maren Hassinger at Dia Bridgehampton, where she created a series of fabric panels printed with her work Circle of Bushes and 2 new bush sculptures on the outside grounds. So this actually marks Maren's second collaboration with Dia, so we're really lucky to have this sustained relationship with the artist. Hassinger was a lecturer in the Department of Art at Stony Brook Southampton, New York from 1992 to 1997 and served as director of the Rinehart School of Sculpture at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore from 1997 to 2018. Hassinger currently lives and works in New York. And Allie Tepper is a curator and art historian. She is the associate curator at the Cooley Gallery at Reed College in Portland, where she is currently curating a forthcoming exhibition, Las Vegas Ikebana, Maren Hassinger and Senga Nengudi, focusing on the collaboration of these two artists, both of whom are on view at Dia Beacon. She is also a guest curator at the Sugar Hill Children's Museum of Art and Storytelling in Harlem, a visiting lecturer of art history at the University of Albany, and was previously the assistant director of Triple Canopy here in New York. Tepper is also the co-editor of the publication Side by Side, Collaborative Artistic Practices in the United States from the 1960s to the 1980s, which was published in 2020. And she has curated numerous exhibitions and performance programs for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, as well as for the Whitney Museum of American Art and Sculpture Center, both in New York. She received her master's degree in modern and contemporary art history from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Tepper also lives in New York. It's such a pleasure to be here together with these amazing interlocutors and the artist herself, and with all of you in the presence of the work of art itself, which is just so special to be embodied and share this space together. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Allie.
Okay. Yay. Thank you so much, Jordan, and to Dia for this invitation, and for the incredible effort that went into bringing Field here so that we could all enjoy it collectively. Obviously, it's such an honor to talk about Maren's work and to do so right in front of the artist herself. So, Maren, I'll try to do this piece justice. But I wanted to start by reciting some words of Maren's, which appear in her writings and performative works from the 80s to ground us in the poetics and urgencies of her practice, and in this piece Field, which we have the opportunity to be in collective presence with today. So, excerpt 1. I want to remember how the trees and fields look at sunset or dawn. I want to remember how the trees and fields look at sunset or dawn. I want to remember how the trees and fields look at sunset or dawn. Excerpt 2, written after the work of Southern novelist Walker Percy. The weeds smell like iron, the wind smells of trees. The weeds smell like iron, the wind smells of trees. The weeds smell like iron, the wind smells of trees. Trees, iron, trees, iron, trees, iron, trees, iron, trees. So these messages can be heard in Voices, a performance written and choreographed by Maren in 1984, a year after Field was made, that was presented at the Women's Building in Los Angeles. And in Voices, Maren acts as a conductor for a discordant choir of performers that included artists Ulysses Jenkins, Senga Nengudi, and May Sun, who communicate a deluge of social and environmental qualms. And they appear again years later in a piece called Talking Book, which is an artist book made by Maren and her beloved friend and collaborator Senga Nengudi in 1988, which consisted of a Walkman housed in a book constructed of twigs and moss that played an audio collage of eco-poetry. Arguably the most central concern of Maren's work, which has endured since the 70s into the present, is, to quote the artist as she wrote in 1988, our relation to an ever-vanishing natural world. As a headline for a recent profile on Maren that was recently featured in the LA Times concurs, proving the longevity of this concern. If nature is vanishing, what else is there to think about? Maren's work, as this exhibition at Dia so clearly demonstrates, is now finally claiming its rightful place in art history in discourses of environmentalism, post-minimalism, conceptual art, dance, and performance, which it has always been of, if not historically included in. This work Field, a tight grid of 182 components of wire rope planted in mounds of concrete, which appear like sheaths of wheat or waving grass, is emblematic of one of Maren's primary concerns, with the fields that are raised over, burnt, flooded, or dried out. But it also references the more conceptual and theoretical fields within a discourse of art that Maren has, in her own style and form, radically reworked. Field, for instance, refuses a notion of the grid as described by art historian Rosalind Krauss in her widely cited 1979 essay Grids as what art looks like when it turns its back on nature. Maren's grid, eccentric and wild, constructed from scavenged industrial wire rope to reference a ubiquitous agricultural form or a biblical garden, is materially all about nature, even as it points to its physical absence. And crucially, Maren's work is not just about nature in some detached or romantic sense, but it's about our dynamic relationship to it. It's about the person who walks around the piece, about our human connectedness and dependencies on one another and our environment, our own potential vanishings, which are entwined with that of the flora. Fields are a motif that Maren has returned to repeatedly in her work for many years, and this elegiac installation is in many ways Maren's answer to her desire to remember how the trees and fields look at sunset or dawn, a way of holding nature in memory and time, in presence if not place. Artist Senga Nengudi, whose work is on view at Dia Beacon in an adjacent gallery, has used the word electric to describe the first time she saw one of Maren's wire sculptures at the Arco Center in Los Angeles in 1976. Senga's attraction to Maren's wire sculptures had to do with the vital energy it emitted. Despite the rigidity of steel, through Maren's hand it flexes and unravels, tangles, and leans. Maren's own fascination with the material began while in graduate school in California as one of the first students in UCLA's short-lived fiber structure department. And to read her artistic trajectory in terms of academic training is really a study in Maren's own willful undisciplining of artistic media as she was persistently sorted into specific schools. As is often cited by the artist in narrating the origin story of her practice, Maren wanted to be a dancer, but her undergraduate alma mater of Bennington College, located in southern Vermont, which is renowned for its modern dance program co-founded by Martha Graham, did not accept her into their department over a question of technique. This rerouted her into the sculpture department, where she was embraced by a South African professor named Isaac Witkin, a modernist. And at Bennington, she began making her first spatial compositions made with welded steel or painted wood that she planted in fields outside the studio art building. Then for graduate school, she applied for an MFA in sculpture at UCLA, but she was met with an admissions panel of then sculpture students who Maren has recalled as being a white boys club, a club to which she was not accepted. So at UCLA, she was instead ushered into a new fiber structure program that was led by the textile designer Bernard Kester, who became a mentor. But despite these institutional attempts to narrow the scope and terms of possibility for Maren's practice, which were undoubtedly coded in racial and gendered inequities, here we might think of the word discipline for its other connotation of control. Maren, however, never disavowed her interests, and she ingeniously found a form and a material that could meet the multiplicity of her desires. So her varied lines of artistic pursuit of dance, sculpture, and fiber are all expansively present in her work and can be read specifically within her wire formulations. Maren first discovered wire rope in a junkyard on Alameda Street in Los Angeles, and she began quickly recycling the material through her own embodied processes. So while the material is strong enough to stand on its own as sculpture, it is elementally fiber. It consists of multiple strands of wires that are twisted about a single core to form a rope. So to make her wire installations, Maren often applies, however consciously or not, principles common to both dance composition and weaving through acts of assembly, friction, crossings, huddles, and knots. Wire rope in its everyday use is, industrial use, is associated with mechanical power, the kinetic energy of hoisting and hauling material from one site to another, originally used in mines, and later the machinery of cranes, elevators, bridges, and railways. As commonly defined, it's a flexible rope structure designed to cope with fast movement and bending stresses. Amidst the expanding sprawl of Los Angeles, Maren's wire rope is the very residue of the industrial urban landscape and the motion of machinery that she employed as lamentations of a disappearing natural world. As she's noted, use of these manufactured materials is both a warning and a plea and suggests a time for nostalgia. Reflecting on her early concerns with the built environment in 1985, Maren has said, "As my career has gone on, I've gotten more concerned with nature. It's a reaction to being an urban dweller surrounded by the ugliness of concrete." And yet, far from being simply a melancholic representation of urban residue, Maren critiques industrial power through her own intimate physical conversions of her material. And these conversions are intensely physical. The levity and lyricism of Maren's forms is counteracted by the weight and gravity of her materials, which require considerable effort and sweat to manipulate. As the late art historian Maurice Berger, who wrote one of the first historical essays on Maren's work in 1991, has claimed, Hassinger's work centers on the concrete qualities of materials and their oppressive associations, to which I add ultimately transforming them to suggest other possible conditions. To return to the concept of electricity, the term signals a physical enlivenment of forms and an alternative source of power located within the movements of the body itself. A common first step for Maren every time she approaches wire rope is to unwind it, turning what was so tightly contained as cable into a gesture of release, the wire a record of the unwinding. Though the wire maintains the memory of its previous state, unwound it suddenly conjures associations with any number of natural motions, a rippling current, waving grass, a dancer whirling. The artist has claimed, "I noticed the material began to resemble living, moving, growing things. Titles like whirling, leaning, walking, and trees became appropriate." The titles she mentions here are all verbs aside from trees, to which we might also add field, which here, read among the rest, asks to be considered for its liveness. Maren's correlation between the motions of any animate force, human or environmental, also attests to the artist's deep understanding of the entanglements of land and people, and her long-standing belief that nature is a continuation of ourselves. After giving birth to her first child, Ava, Maren recalls observing her own umbilical cord in a moment of revelation, as if her instinctual transformations of wire rope into something natural, life-giving even, was grounded in an elemental and deeply embodied place. And this maternal reference also places Maren's work in dialogue with that of her close comrade, Senga Nengudi. Senga herself began her renowned sculpture series, RSVP, which were constructions of nylon stockings that were filled with sand to stretch and sag like skin, when she was newly pregnant and observing changes in her own physical form. Cord, a connective bond, a maternal material, a first and necessary foundation of human growth. Beyond Maren's investment in exploring the innate kinetic possibilities of her materials, and specifically wire rope, she also at times danced alongside her works or with material refuse from the studio. And this is something she often did with Senga Nengudi, with whom she shared a dance lineage. Both Maren and Senga were trained in a West Coast movement system called the Lester Horton technique, which was an athletic, anatomically informed movement designed to fortify the entire body through positions like hinges, swings, and lateral tilts that extended a dancer's possible range of movement. Notably, Maren was called upon by Senga to partner and dance responsively with her series RSVP, which she did for the first time in 1977, and which is documented in a series of now iconic photographs where Maren appears literally entangled in, at once stretching and held by, the fabric of her friend. There was an incredibly generative exchange between these two artists that occurred in this early period through dance, which fed back into their respective studio practices and work in sculpture. The same year that Maren was performing with RSVP, she created Tree Duet 1 and 2, dances for the camera, where she appears moving in dialogue with a sculpture called Pas de Deux, a 10-foot-long tangling form made of a scavenged peach tree trunk and wire rope, the ends of which the artist unplied to fray out like the fractal branches of a tree. Named after the classical ballet phrase for a dance between two people, Maren's Pas de Deux was itself a performative turn of phrase that recast the language of ballet into her own distinctive language of expanded dance. And the work is less about a heteronormative marriage plot, which the Pas de Deux typically entails, than about the possible formal entanglements, the more everyday duets that occur between materials and people in the world and in the studio. Partnering with the structure, in those photographs, Maren dances alongside her work, never touching but moving her body in dialogue with its forms, turning an arm like a twisting rope, leaning her hips out as a bending trunk, or engaging a Horton high lateral tilt that echoes the position of a branch fragment leaning on the studio wall behind her. Through these acts of mirroring, Maren identifies herself with her assembled materials. Her embodiment of the forms and positions of the work, as seen in those images, became a means of archiving both her sculpture, which did not survive, and forms of nature through her body, through the physical memory of movement or as feeling, anticipating, to use the artist's words, a time for nostalgia. Field was first presented in 1983 in a 4-person exhibition, which included LA-based painters Phoebe Beasley and Varnett Honeywood, and printmaker and sculptor Betty Saar. The exhibition was organized by the artist Carrie James Marshall for the LA Southwest College Art Gallery, a university gallery located at a community college in LA, where Marshall was then teaching. While presenting work amongst her peers and within a context of mutual support that ran counter to the institutional mainstream, what art historian Kelly Jones has called a Black counter-public sphere, Maren's kinetic and highly formal abstract work would have stood out amongst that of the other women who were engaged in more figurative and graphic traditions. In a photograph of Field at the LA Southwest Gallery taken by photographer Adam Avila, the piece appears installed indoors and dramatically lit, its shadows heightening the Field's form high above its structure. The piece in that presentation has a commanding presence or power, not a field to be trampled on or raced over, but one that beckons our respect and attention, a kind of counter-memorial that stands planted firmly on the ground. 2 years later, the piece was shown again, this time at the California State University Northridge in a smaller site-specific composition, this time abutting a window in the gallery like a kind of window box, with one row of the grid indoors pressed up against the glass and the rest continuing out. This exploration of the window and its architectural geometry was something Maren would continue exploring later in an exhibition called Window Boxes, curated by Thelma Golden for the Whitney Museum's Philip Morris building in Midtown, where Maren planted her wire forms by the glass walls of the building's expansive atrium space. In Field's early presentation by the window, the piece literally cuts through the building, dissolving the boundaries between inside and outside, just as she muddles the divisions between nature and industry through the material of wire rope itself. And here we might think of the bounds of the building as a metaphor for the bounds of the self, mirroring the artist's desire to become one with nature, or as she wrote in the program from Window Boxes, to enlarge and flow, to lose my ego. The work reflects an emphasis on wholeness rather than separation, which is a tenet of a womanist theology and orientation towards the environment and one another. It feels appropriate on the topic of wholeness that this presentation at Dia brings all 182 components of Field together for the first time. The work has aged now 40 years and bears the patina of time. Its steel surface is now a reddish-brown hue, its long stalks appearing more natural than ever. The weeds still smell like iron, the wind still smells like trees, and Maren's work in a moment of heightened environmental crisis, when the very rhythms of our world are out of sync, could not be more necessary. The opportunity to be in relationship to Field is an invitation into a space of serenity and centeredness. And by implicating ourselves in the piece, Maren reminds us that our survival is bound up with one another and that we still have work to do. So I'm going to leave that there, and then maybe we can transition to a conversation. Great, shall we?
Thank you so much, Allie, for that. Those beautiful words, so sensitively attuned to the piece and Maren's practice. You touched so much on Maren's really critical, beautiful, sensitive, powerful relationship to nature. So I wanted to maybe start there with you, Maren, and ask, with you, of course, with the artist. We're in front of Field, and you've made many works that sort of emulate sort of natural or organic forms that we might find in the landscape, be it a field, a branch, a tree, a bush. And I'm curious to hear just a bit more about your relationship to nature and sort of how you came to sort of choose these organic phenomena as your primary visual vocabulary.
Good questions. Thank you all for being here, really. I am overwhelmed by your presence. I've worked really, really hard to be the best artist I could be, and I thank Dia for maybe recognizing that. Nature is all around us. It's what we come from. When we read the Bible, there was a Garden of Eden. We don't have that garden anymore, and that's what my work is about. And though one could say, oh, well, that's a horrible, depressing idea, and I have a glorious garden in my back, and, this isn't a Garden of Eden, and this is what it is. That's what I think I'm doing. I think I'm talking about where we are and what we are, and yet I keep making it, and I think it's a very positive thing to be making something. To use your imagination in whatever way your facilities allow you to make things that appeal to you and possibly others. And I encourage more than anything else, creative activity of one description or the next. I mean, it could be making dinner. It could be making pudding. It could be making punch. It could be taking a walk and gathering flowers and bringing them back and putting them in your home. It could be spending time in a place where you buy scarves and just spending time looking at those scarves and buying one and bringing it back and looking at that scarf and wearing that scarf and making that part of how you feel about walking through a day and how it looks next to your skin and next to the rest of your clothing. Visual ability we possess, and we can all use it and be affected by it. And maybe the difference that you might see within yourself and with me and my contributions to visual art are that when it was time for me to make a decision about what to do with my life, I didn't have a lot of choices. I went to a place where you could choose your major, and you had, you had counselors who, helped you with your choices, and my counselor happened to be the accompanist for the dance department. And so I went to him when we started our discussion. I said, well, I want to be a dance major. And he said, well, what about art? And I said, well, yeah, art is, it's okay, but I want to be a dance major. And he said, but you're better in art. And I was very disappointed because I really loved to dance. I loved flying around to the music, and it was a terrible, terrible disappointment. I thought I would leave Bennington College, and I don't know, I think I talked to some other people. I talked to my wonderful counselor, Pat Adams, and I ended up staying there for 4 years, making lots of sculptures, and my teacher, Isaac Whitkin, said at this final sculptural presentation, you did good, honey. So.
Although you did, for the good of history, decided to continue with visual arts, but you never really gave up on dancing, and that's something that has really influenced the way in which you approach your material, and also approach the way your material is installed in space and dialogue with other bodies. So I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit about your approach to material and how dance informs that, and maybe even about how Allie in her presentation and her lecture spoke a bit about the ways in which you've actually danced in and amongst your work and sort of almost treated your metal sculptures as both scenography or even a dance partner.
Well, the reason why I wanted to be a dance major is because I remember the thrill of very early on in my first dance classes. At the end of class, we would jump over these phone books. And there was like this, run, 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 leap over the phone book. Run, 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 leap over the phone. And it was, it was great. And what was the question again?
The question, I guess, is, how do you see the influence of dance and movement in relationship to your work, or say a work like Field, how does the body sort of relate?
Well, you all have the experience of driving by a field that's been planted and, feeling like you just wanted to kind of run your hand over the whole thing because of the fact that it's all more or less the same height, same colors, same stuff is being produced. And I guess that's what this came from. And I think the criticism I got on this piece was, well, the wire rope looks nice, but what are those things holding it up? There's, horrible splotches of things on the bottom. But, I didn't feel that way about it. That's why I did it, and that's what I could do. I could do that. I wasn't going to make a form that, I had to first make the form, then I had to pour the concrete, then I had to put the thing. I wasn't going to do that. That I could do, and that's what I wanted to do, and that I did. And aesthetically, okay, maybe the teacher didn't like it that much. I was done with it, and that was it. And I do believe a lot of things get made like that. I think they get made because of stubbornness or running out of paint or, the brush broke or something like that. And then the artist can look back on it and see that they can live with that, and it becomes like part of the family, why kill it, So I don't think I have a very formal relationship to the making of art.
Just maybe if I could ask one more question for giving it over to Allie to ask a bit from her perspective. But on the note of the formal, but also maybe even the conceptual, as it relates to process and again the body, I'm curious about this piece because there is sort of this, very intentional idea to make it a grid, and there's uniformity in terms of the spacing between these cement bases. I believe for this iteration it's about 2 inches we decided on, and there's sort of that sense of regularity, but also when you perceive the piece as the sort of dense, organic metal outgrowth comes vertically up, it sort of begins to deny its very structural geometry. And you begin to sort of see this tension at play, which I think really gets at a lot of the tension in your work between the industrial and the organic. But here, between sort of the grid and something that is this analytical geometry, and something that's more indeterminate, something more organic, something that is sort of defiant of that rigidity. So I'm curious if you could reflect on that, or maybe what made you decide to choose the grid, which, in the 1960s and 70s, coming out of conceptual art, and minimalism, us being a Dia beacon, the grid is something you see a lot of, or something that is sort of, an underpinning, a real sort of pillar of these movements. Why you maybe chose to deploy it in this manner?
I want to be part of the gang. That's all.
But you're not just being a part of it in a way, you're kind of resisting it, or you're actually sort of taking it to a different place too.
Well, I might have taken it to a different place because the way I used the materials was different from maybe some of the other materials that other people used. But I've also very intentionally made squares and rectangles that did line up like grids. This just happens to be a case of, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to slap this together. Which I think works here because when you go outside and you see things growing up, they're not on this very rigid, flat, concrete. They're coming up out of dirt that's all kinds of different shapes and a big mess. And, they grow straight, but the ground is a mess. Yeah.
So you've talked a little bit about you're really authentic relationships to art, that they're not always very formal, even though you do have a really strong formal vocabulary. But I thought one of the things I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the square and the grid is your relationship to the sandbox that your dad made. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because the sandbox that I understand your father made for you as a child is a square that has sand in it, and it has this play of organic and rigidity and movement in terms of what you did in the sandbox. So,
Well, I wish I had known you were going to ask that question, because I would have brought the boat that he made when he was in school, which is, I still have, that I sailed on those rivers that I made in that sandbox he made for me. And every time I look at it, I just remember all of that. I mean, how many people here have done that, have made furrows in their sandbox and filled them with water? How many? I want to see how many. More. You did that. You did. Okay, so here's the thing. It's satisfying. It's incredibly satisfying to make a river. And maybe that's kind of the beginning of, thinking, well, if I could make this river and feel really great about it, then I can make other things that I can feel great about. Maybe. But it was really like taking a vacation to make that river and sail those things. It was fabulous. And I guess if one has the opportunity to have that kind of childhood experience, you'd like to repeat it as an adult, and I guess that's more or less what happened.
It's serendipitous that you brought up sand, which evoked in my mind really quickly a piece we have on view of artist Senga Nengudi, in which he's created sort of this floor-based installation made out of sand, which made me think of the collaboration and sort of the shared sensibilities between the two of you, which made me want to think about collaboration. And that's going to be a question for both you and Allie, as the two of you are collaborating on an exhibition that's opening in the next month or so at the Cooley Art Gallery at Reed, that will be actually focused on the collaborations between you and Senga Nengudi. And so I guess first for you, Maren, just to maybe reflect on what collaboration means to you, or what does it mean to collaborate with someone in the making of something, and what does it mean for you to be on view at Dia Bridgehampton with your lifelong dear friend and collaborator Senga Nengudi. And then maybe as a follow-up to you, Allie, I'm curious about collaboration as a mode of curatorial practice, but also the subject.
Well, I think Senga and I met and became friends and stayed friends because, as both of us in different classes with different teachers, but with the philosophy of the dance that we were learning, was by this man named Lester Horton. And as far as I know about Lester's history as a choreographer, he was the first to have an integrated group of dancers performing theatrically, and so many wonderful, wonderful dancers came out of that. One of them was Carmen de Lavalade, and later I took many classes from her sister Yvonne, and also from Lelia Goldoni. It's just, the sense of collaboration. Usually you don't think about that in terms of visual art. Usually it's like this genius who's painting these fabulous, Rembrandt, Rembrandt is always imagined and pictured as being this solo person making these, brilliant additions to visual art. And Senga and I just didn't evolve that way. We evolved from dance. I literally evolved from the dance department not accepting me in my college And then I had to do this other thing that I, didn't know all that much about. But when I ran into Senga after graduation from college, we just had so much fun making these. It was kind of like being a child again. And from there, we had this association, and it all kind of occurred around this time of when performance was very active, and what was like very nuanced for artists who were, used to making objects on the floor or wall, would, be involved with. So we did that, and we did that for many years. And we did a lot of work together. And I think not only did it give us insight into collaboration, it gave us insight into how one might use space appropriately. It gave us insight into how we could work with others, because often we would have other people with us. And it just gave us the idea and the concept that to be a visual artist is to have freedom and to choose whatever you want. Just do it.
That's beautiful. Yeah, for me, collaboration, when you look at art through the mode of collaboration, it produces different meaning, or you see things in art that you don't normally see. But that is definitely a part of art history. These kinds of exchanges that are happening, maybe, I don't know, kind of tangentially to a work, but then feed back into the work, or that are more ephemeral, movement-based, performative, but then feed back into a sculptural practice. I think with you and Maren, you and Senga, there's the residue of your exchange and your all the energy that you guys shared together is just, you would then run back to the studio and make a sculpture. And in so many ways, we feel that in the work, And so I think for me, it's just a really vital way of understanding how art is made, and also the way in which we depend on one another, right? And that we don't make art in a vacuum, or we don't do anything in a vacuum. So this whole getting out of an ego-based mindset is something I think institutions can also learn from and try to embody. And so that's something that I kind of care about as a curator. Yeah, and actually, thinking about the sandbox and the water, it's funny because Maren and Senga have, later in life, they went to a residency together in Maine, and they started making a piece called Gravel Dance, where they kind of returned to that concept of the sandbox, and you guys play in the sand and pour water, and you kind of make your own adult version of a gravel dance. Yeah, so it's very on topic, actually.
But
yeah.
It wasn't as good as the first one. When we were this high. Right.
I'm going to return to the piece in the formal, in the bodily, and, think a little bit more about process again, and maybe as it relates to this piece, but also more broadly in terms of your work with wire work. But one of the sort of discoveries and sort of the special things about this presentation of field is that as we were sort of resuscitating it from the archive, if you will, we sort of, rediscovered the fact that in its 2 times of presentation, it had been shown in a grid of about 100 units, but you had actually serially created 182, giving us the opportunity to sort of show it in such a new density for the first time. But sort of reflecting on this process, you were talking about the seriality, how you wanted to just keep making, almost sort of turning this process of unraveling, unfurling these cables of wire rope into something almost machinic. So I was curious, maybe as you sort of almost embody this tension between the industrial and the organic, sort of what that sort of means for you in terms of when you're this process and such an intensive physical labor.
What does it mean to literally
Are,
find all that?
well, I guess not what does it mean, but rather, what is that process like? Could you maybe talk a little bit about that physicality, that physical process, and what does it take to actually physically unwind this wire rope and such great value in in such what I believe was a relatively short period of time that you were doing this on all 182 of these bundles that you created?
That's a really good question, actually. But, you know, we have to remember when it was made when there was all this seriality around me that I was looking at in galleries and museums. So I'm going to do my version of it, and, you know, that's it.
But was it intense? I'm like, what is that? I mean, it can't be easy to like physically. I've never done it, so I don't know. But I imagine looking at it that it's quite a physical engagement.
Yeah, but I would imagine, like, if you're a pianist and having a concert, and you have to play, you know, 6 pieces in the concert, and you're given a year to prepare for it, or 6 months to prepare for it, that is the same thing, if not worse. You know? It just, so it's repetitive. So when we think about Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionist paintings, which we all, you know, laud and magnify for good reason, we see pictures of him kind of running around the periphery of the canvases and tossing paint on, and running around, tossing paint on. The only difference, I think, between that and this is that for some reason, I had to keep repeating and repeating and repeating the same thing over and over again. And that, in part, may be because I wasn't using paint. I was using wire rope. And wire rope is extruded, and it's just the same coil going around and around and around. So I think material has a lot to do with what finally happens. And it's material and its manipulation. Because I could have done other things to this material, but I did that.
And you've actually manipulated wire rope in such a variety of forms and ways throughout your career. But I guess to go back to that origin point, maybe you could tell us, you know, I mean, as Allie mentioned in her lecture, you discovered wire rope for the first time around 1970 in a junkyard in LA. But can you maybe talk about this encounter and what sort of moved you to want to work with this particular material and for, you know, the duration of your career? And are you as excited about that material now as you were then? Or, you know, what was it about wire rope that, you know, really drew you in that way, in that encounter?
Well, let me describe how I first came across this wire rope. I was in a junkyard. It was just laying there. I was in a weaving class. I was trying to find out how I could do something that would liven up the class. And I picked it up and I went, oh, you know, it's steel, but it's fiber. Okay, so then I got, I found out where it was sold. You know, like, oh yeah, there's actually companies that sell this and charge you an arm and leg. Okay. So then I went over and I had some conversations with them, and they were willing to cut me a very short length. And one of the first pieces I made was this short length that they cut me. And it was, everybody in this room would have thought to do what I did. It was a long length. It was maybe like from that wall to where that piece of tape is right there. And I just said, oh, I'll join the two ends. So I think my husband, Peter Hassinger, helped me like pull the two ends together, and then I bound it off with lots of twine and small rope. And when I felt it was secure enough, I undid the ends that were left open and just like wove them back together as best I could. And that was the piece. And that suited me fine because it didn't take very long to do. It wasn't that expensive. There wasn't that much technical, and I didn't need a whole lot of help to do it. And came out. And I just kept doing it. You just like, well, I can make that tree with watercolors and it looks pretty good. I guess I'll keep doing it, and that's what I did. And my subject became the issue of, like, this is this highly fabricated, contemporary material that holds up elevators and, this thing and that thing that are just impossible for me to really imagine. But I'm going to use it as if it were the fiber that it actually is. And I did, and that's one of the things that I made.
Yeah, and I think we can tell in your work, that you really listen to the material itself, that your relationship to sculpture is about this like deep understanding of the material. I recently had to handle one of your works, your wire works, for the first time, and I was like, how is this put together? It was some of your leaning pieces, and I was surprised by the fact that, they're not like welded or like they're not really even hinged. They just kind of hold on to one another, like there's this like friction happening to them, and there's this sense in which like you're just letting the material also engage as it naturally would, and forming compositions that are like very, very, of the material, as opposed to like imposing something onto your material. Yeah, or like welding, like all the other guys in the sculpture studio probably were.
Well, welding, has its place, of course. But if everybody's welding, why would you continue to weld? I mean, we know what's going to happen with the welding, so let's move on. And I was so fortunate, and I was actually incredibly fortunate that the traditional sculpture class didn't accept me. And the fiber structure class did. Because that is an object of fiber sculpture. Yeah. I mean, maybe somebody had a plan. Sometimes I wonder what. But the moral of that story is, if you want to do something, like get an MFA, you can do it. And you don't have to do it where you thought you were going to do it. You can do it somewhere else and still get an MFA. And meet a lot of nice people and have lifelong friendships and, I had a dinner with Bernard Kester. I'm sure he was ill. I'm sure he knew stuff was going on with him. He didn't let that on. We just enjoyed our dinner and he said goodbye. And that was lovely. And that was like a real relationship. And yeah, maybe I could have had it in other classes with other people, but I was really happy I had it with him. He was a swell person, just swell. And before we wrap this up, which we're about to do, right? We're about to do that. I want to introduce you to three people who are very important to me. I don't want to embarrass them, but these three people right here, if you could either stand up or raise your hand or do something so that people could see who you are. You three. 1, 2, 3. Right. So this is Desmond Beach. He was an excellent, wonderful student and became friend from my days teaching college. And this is my daughter Ava, who has been my glorious, glorious friend since she came squalling out. And now she's a wonderful teacher of art. in an historically black institution, and she's just really talented and very smart. And this is my assistant, Cole Palatini, who came out today and helps me like organize all the sculptural stuff, helps me build it, and makes all the phone calls and does all the emails because I can't deal with a computer. So here are the three people who are responsible for me being here today and who really help me have fun every day. And you have helped me have fun making this presentation, and you two have been very well prepared. So on that note, may I? Yeah, yes. May I? Thank you. Now, if, please, come up and look at the piece.
But also, maybe we could open it up for some audience questions, maybe?
And let's be careful.
I think we have a mic here with Kim, and actually, before we do that, I also want to do my own round of thank yous here to our amazing team here at Dia, to Kim Golding, and also Zuna Maza and Dan Wolf for their amazing support of making this program possible. And Kim actually has a mic, so if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. Any questions, anybody? Oh, we have one here in the front row. Just wait 1 second till the mic makes it over to you.
I like that.
Right here.
Hey, just a kind of quick question about when you were unraveling the wire. I was just so curious to know if you were wearing gloves, what kind of gloves you had.
Oh, regular
any.
hardware.
Cool.
Yeah.
So-
Because like the plastic gloves that you use for cleaning and stuff, they would just tear up.
I bet they would. So did you have leather gloves?
No, they weren't always leather.
Yeah.
They were that kind of rough with that stuff. But, in the hardware store.
Sure,
And
yeah.
then after a while, when they wear out, get another pair. It's not real expensive.
Right.
And also, I didn't use any tools, basically, except screwdrivers.
One thing I love about the idea that all of them are separate pieces, each pod or whatever.
Yeah.
It really brings to mind the idea that you might have been a choreographer with your troupe, deciding where everybody was going to stand and arranging the density and the exploding point. With the grid.
You hit on something, which is I always did want to be a choreographer, but since they wouldn't let me go to dance class, that was going to be hard. So
I just immediately thought that the grid reminded me of what you might do from the start of the dance.
I've really been connected to dance ever since I jumped over those phone books. Right. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, we have one right here in this.
Thank you. When I'm looking and experiencing your work, I'm not sure if it's intentional on your part or if I'm just putting it in there, but was there a sense that you wanted to kind of respond in a feminine way to the male grid and all of that? Like, did you do it with that intention, or is it just how I'm reading it?
I am aware of my predecessors who were like 99% men, I think. But I'm not a man, and I'm not them. So that gives me freedom to do anything I want to do. Oh, I'm sorry. So that gives me freedom to do anything I want to do. So I was really interested in seriality. I was really interested in this material wire rope, and I had to figure out a way to get it to stand up if I wanted to make this garden or this field. And so that's the way I did it. And I mean, there is a criticism about this, that I just plopped down the concrete like I didn't, pay any attention to it. I could have controlled it and, cast it in squares or rectangles or anything I wanted to do. And I didn't. Maybe I should still do that. I can. But in the meantime, this is what I did with this. And to me, it's held up a long time, and it must have been okay somewhere, because here it is.
I know I've asked too many questions, but on that note of time, I just want to ask one last question, which is, as you said, this has held up so well, and it's around 41 years old, but it has changed over time. And in the process of us, cleaning it, preparing it for presentation, you made a very deliberate choice, not to sort of manicure it or sort of do anything to reverse its aging process, whether you sort of embraced its patina. And I was hoping maybe you could just reflect on that decision and sort of thinking about your works as objects that, like us, live in the world.
Well, I don't think I'm from the time of Michelangelo when maybe everybody felt it had to last 12 millennia or, till the end of the world or something. I don't think anything's like that anymore. Everything is passing. Although, it's going to take a lot to get that rusty enough to fall apart, I can tell you. So enough. We're not going to be around. That'll still be standing. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we have one more question here in the center.
No, you.
Yep. He's got it.
I know that we're in Dia, but I like the heart of this place is the Nabisco factory, and I also think back to your monuments project in Harlem, and I'm just wondering, is like the site specificity important to you when you were doing your work, or you're thinking about exhibiting your work?
Sometimes site specific inspires me to what I'm going to do, and the things relate to what's at the site, and sometimes they don't, and they're simply objects like every other kind of painting or drawing or sculpture you might find in a traditional museum. This is more like that. This is an object in space. It's a large one, it's made of many units, but if you think about, my age and what I came out of, this whole issue of seriality is kind of like, I guess you would say, to painters of the Jackson Pollock era, like splashing paint around. Like the grid is a really important, both technical and aesthetic thing in my generation. And maybe always, maybe it should be, because it really relates to the things, the places where we live, the way things are planted, the way cars drive down the street, the way we sit in rows when we were children at school. It really relates to the way we carry on our lives.
That sounds like a beautiful way to end it. And so thank you.
Thank you. You're a lovely audience. Very attentive. Thank you. It's a pleasure.